The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Mickey's Diner on West 8th Street in Cincinnati, creating rivulets that distorted the neon signs from across the street. It was the kind of October evening that made people want to stay indoors, nursing hot coffee and watching the world blur past through rain-streaked glass. The diner, with its checkered floors and red vinyl booths, had been a fixture in the neighborhood for over 40 years, serving comfort food to everyone from construction workers grabbing breakfast before dawn to late-night revelers seeking refuge from their mistakes. Pete Rose pushed through the heavy glass door, shaking droplets from his leather jacket. At 55, the former Cincinnati Reds legend still carried himself with the confident stride that had made him Charlie Hustle during his playing days, though the years had softened his edges and added silver to his temples. The familiar bell above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful chime that seemed to cut through the diner's ambient noise of clinking plates and muted conversations. He had discovered Mickey's about 6 months ago, quite by accident. After a particularly difficult meeting with his lawyer about ongoing legal troubles stemming from his gambling past, he had needed somewhere quiet to think. The diner had become his refuge, a place where he could disappear into anonymity, where the weight of his complicated legacy felt lighter among the honest working people who frequented the establishment. Sarah Martinez looked up from behind the counter as the door opened, her tired eyes brightening slightly when she recognized the regular customer who always sat in booth 7. She had been working the evening shift at Mickey's for 2 years now, ever since her husband Miguel had been injured in a construction accident that left him unable to work. The diner job, combined with her morning shift at a local grocery store, barely covered their rent and medical bills, but it was honest work, and Sarah took pride in treating every customer with the same warm professionalism. "Evening, Mr. Rose," she called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. She had recognized him on his 3rd visit, though she had never made a big deal about it. In her experience, famous people appreciated being treated like everyone else, especially when they were clearly seeking solitude. Pete nodded gratefully and made his way to his usual booth, appreciating Sarah's discretion. She was probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of long hours and hard work. Her English carried the faint accent of someone who had learned it as a second language, and Pete had gleaned from overheard conversations with other staff that she was supporting not just herself, but also her injured husband and their young daughter. The diner was busier than usual for a Tuesday night, probably because of the rain driving people indoors. Pete settled into the familiar comfort of booth 7, its red vinyl seats worn smooth by countless customers over the decades. From his vantage point, he could observe the entire restaurant, a habit developed during his playing days, when being aware of his surroundings had been crucial for both performance and safety. At a large table near the center of the diner sat a group of 6 men in expensive suits, their voices carrying the confident boom of people accustomed to being the most important presence in any room. Pete recognized the type immediately. Successful businessmen out for dinner, probably celebrating some deal or merger. Their table was littered with empty beer bottles and the remains of what appeared to be an extended meal. Sarah approached his table with practiced efficiency, coffee pot in one hand and a menu in the other, though they both knew he didn't need it. "The usual?" she asked with a genuine smile that reached her eyes, despite the exhaustion Pete could see in the slight slump of her shoulders. "You know me too well," Pete replied, returning her smile. "Though maybe add some apple pie tonight. This weather's got me feeling nostalgic." "Coming right up. The pie's fresh. Mrs. Henderson made it this afternoon." Sarah poured his coffee with steady hands, the stream precise and practiced. "How was your day?" It was a simple question, the kind servers asked 100 times a shift, but something in Sarah's tone suggested genuine interest rather than professional courtesy. Pete appreciated that about her. She had a way of making even casual conversation feel authentic. "Can't complain," he said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Though I could do without this rain. Makes my old joints remind me I'm not 25 anymore." Sarah chuckled softly. "My husband says the same thing. Weather like this makes his backache something fierce." She glanced toward the kitchen. "Let me get your order in. Danny's backed up tonight with this crowd." As Sarah moved away, Pete's attention was drawn to the loud group at the center table. Their conversation had shifted from business talk to increasingly crude jokes, their laughter becoming more raucous as the evening wore on. The other diners were beginning to glance their way with obvious irritation, but the men seemed oblivious to the discomfort they were causing. Pete had seen this scenario play out countless times during his playing career. Successful men who felt their achievements entitled them to behave however they pleased, regardless of how it affected others. He had learned to navigate such situations carefully, knowing that his fame often made him a target for both admiration and resentment. The kitchen bell rang, and Sarah emerged with a steaming plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, Pete's standard order. She moved with efficient grace through the maze of tables, but as she approached the businessmen's table to refill their water glasses, Pete noticed one of them lean back in his chair, deliberately blocking her path. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely, trying to maneuver around the man's extended leg. The man, clearly the alpha of the group based on how the others deferred to him, looked up at Sarah with a smirk that immediately set Pete's teeth on edge. He was probably in his 40s, with the kind of artificial tan that spoke of expensive vacations and the confident air of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered in his world. "Well, well," the man said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "looks like our little señorita needs to get by." His emphasis on the Spanish word was deliberately mocking, and Pete saw Sarah's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I just need to refill your water, sir," Sarah replied, her voice maintaining its professional calm despite the obvious slight. The man made an exaggerated show of moving his leg, then immediately shifted it back as Sarah tried to pass. His companions laughed, clearly enjoying what they perceived as harmless fun. Pete watched Sarah's face carefully, seeing the flush of embarrassment creep up her neck as she realized she was being deliberately toyed with. "Dance a little for us," another member of the group called out, his words slightly slurred from alcohol. "Show us some of those spicy moves." The restaurant had fallen noticeably quieter, other diners now openly staring at the unfolding scene. Pete felt his muscles tense, the competitor in him recognizing the moment when a situation was about to spiral beyond mere rudeness into something much worse. Sarah stood perfectly still for a moment, the water pitcher trembling slightly in her hands. Pete could see her wrestling with the impossible choice faced by service workers everywhere: maintain professional composure in the face of humiliation, or stand up for herself and risk losing the job she desperately needed. "I'm just trying to do my job," she said quietly, but with a dignity that made Pete's chest tighten with respect for her composure. The leader of the group leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly reveling in his power over the situation. "Oh, we know exactly what your job is, sweetheart. The question is, how badly do you want that tip?" Pete's hands clenched around his coffee mug as he watched Sarah's professional mask finally crack, revealing a flash of genuine hurt and anger. In that moment, she wasn't just a server being harassed by drunk customers. She was someone's wife, someone's mother, a person with dreams and struggles and dignity that deserved respect, regardless of her circumstances. The rain continued to beat against the windows, but inside Mickey's diner, the atmosphere had shifted from comfortable warmth to uncomfortable tension. Pete Rose, who had come seeking anonymity and peace, found himself facing a choice that would define not just the evening, but perhaps his own path toward redemption. Pete Rose had spent his entire professional life reading situations, knowing when to steal second base, when to slide headfirst into home plate, when to challenge an umpire's call. The ability to read people and circumstances had been as crucial to his success as his batting average or his legendary hustle. Now, watching Sarah Martinez stand frozen between dignity and desperation, every instinct honed over decades of competition told him this was one of those moments that would define everyone involved. The leader of the business group, emboldened by his companion's laughter and Sarah's apparent helplessness, pushed his chair back further, creating an even more obvious barrier. "Come on, honey," he said with mock sweetness. "All you have to do is ask nicely. Maybe say please with that cute little accent of yours." Sarah's knuckles were white where she gripped the water pitcher, and Pete could see her internal struggle playing out across her face. She needed this job. That much was obvious from every conversation he had overheard about medical bills and rent payments, but she also needed her self-respect, and these men were systematically stripping it away with each passing moment. "Please," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I just need to refill your water." The man's smile widened cruelly. "Louder, sweetheart. I don't think everyone heard you." That's when Pete Rose made his decision. He stood up from booth 7 with deliberate slowness, his chair scraping against the checkered linoleum floor with a sound that cut through the diner's tension like a knife. Every head in the restaurant turned toward him, including the 6 businessmen who suddenly found themselves being scrutinized by someone whose presence carried an unmistakable weight. Pete was not a physically imposing man by modern standards. At 5'9", and carrying the softness that comes with middle age, he would never be mistaken for an intimidator. But there was something in his bearing, in the way he moved with purpose and certainty, that commanded attention. Perhaps it was the confidence that came from having performed under pressure in front of millions of people, or maybe it was simply the moral authority of someone who had finally found his line in the sand. "Gentlemen," Pete said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to being heard, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The leader of the group turned in his chair, annoyance flickering across his features. "Excuse me, old man, but this doesn't concern you." Pete walked slowly toward their table, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his posture radiating a quiet intensity that made several of the men shift uncomfortably. "Actually, it does concern me. You see, this lady here, her name is Sarah, in case you were wondering. She's been nothing but professional and courteous to you all evening, and you're treating her like she's less than human." "Look, buddy," another member of the group interjected, "we're just having some fun. Nobody's getting hurt." Pete's eyes swept across the table, taking in each face with the same careful attention he had once reserved for studying pitchers' tells and defensive alignments. "Fun?" he repeated, his voice remaining calm but gaining an edge that made the word sound sharp. "Humiliating someone who can't fight back because she needs the job. That's your idea of fun." Sarah stood motionless, the water pitcher still clutched in her hands, her eyes moving between Pete and the businessman with a mixture of gratitude and fear. She had never asked for a champion, had never expected this quiet, regular customer to insert himself into her humiliation. But now that it was happening, she felt a complex swirl of emotions she couldn't quite process. The leader of the group was clearly not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by what he perceived as just another middle-aged customer. His face flushed with indignation as he pushed back from the table and stood up, revealing himself to be several inches taller than Pete and probably 20 years younger. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Some white knight trying to impress the help?" The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Every conversation halted as diners and staff alike watched the confrontation unfold. Danny, the cook, had emerged from the kitchen and stood uncertainly behind the counter, clearly torn between calling the police and letting the situation play out. 2 elderly women in a corner booth had their phones out, though whether they were calling for help or recording the scene was unclear. Pete stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the alcohol on the man's breath and see the entitled rage building in his eyes. "I'll tell you exactly who I am," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "I'm someone who believes that how you treat people who can't fight back says everything about who you really are. Is that right?" The businessman's voice dripped with sarcasm. "And what exactly are you going to do about it, Grandpa?" For a moment, Pete felt the familiar surge of competitive fire that had driven him through 24 seasons of professional baseball. The urge to escalate, to prove his point through confrontation, was almost overwhelming. But then he glanced at Sarah, saw the fear in her eyes, not fear of the businessman, but fear that this situation was spiraling beyond her control and might cost her the job she desperately needed. That look changed everything for Pete Rose. This wasn't about him proving his courage or defending his honor. This was about Sarah's dignity and livelihood, and any response had to serve her interests, not his ego. "What am I going to do?" Pete repeated, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm going to make you an offer." The businessman's aggressive posture faltered slightly, confusion replacing some of his anger. "What kind of offer?" Pete reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, a worn leather billfold that had seen better days. From it, he extracted a business card and held it up for everyone to see. "My name is Pete Rose," he said simply, "and I'd like to make a wager with you." The recognition hit the room like a wave, starting with gasps of surprise from the older diners and spreading quickly to everyone present. Even the businessmen seemed taken aback, though their leader tried to maintain his aggressive stance. "Pete Rose?" one of the younger men at the table whispered to his companion. "The baseball player?" Pete nodded once, acknowledging the recognition without dwelling on it. "That's right. And here's my wager. I bet you $500 that you can't walk over to that counter, apologize sincerely to Sarah for your behavior, leave her a tip equal to what your entire table's bill comes to, and then walk out of here with what little dignity you have left intact." The businessman's face cycled through several expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally a return to defiant anger. "You're betting me $500 to apologize to the waitress?" "That's exactly what I'm doing," Pete confirmed. "Of course, if you're not man enough to admit when you're wrong, I understand. Not everyone has the character for it." The challenge hung in the air between them, and Pete could see the man's mind working. $500 was probably pocket change to him, but the public nature of the wager had transformed a simple apology into a test of manhood that he couldn't easily back down from without losing face in front of his companions. Sarah finally found her voice. "Mr. Rose, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," Pete interrupted gently, never taking his eyes off the businessman. "Sometimes we all have to." Dumam. The leader of the group looked around the diner, suddenly aware that every person present was watching him, waiting to see what kind of man he really was when the spotlight was on him. His companions were silent now, the mob mentality that had fueled their earlier behavior dissolving under the weight of individual accountability. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "But when I take your money, I'm going to make sure everyone knows that Pete Rose is just a washed-up has-been who throws away his cash defending illegal immigrants." The racial slur hit the room like a slap, and Pete felt every muscle in his body tense with fury. But again, he looked at Sarah, saw the pain in her eyes, and remembered that this wasn't about him. It was about her dignity, her ability to work without harassment, her right to be treated like a human being, regardless of her accent or her circumstances. "We'll see about that," Pete said quietly. Clocks ticking. The silence in Mickey's diner was deafening, broken only by the persistent drumming of rain against the windows and the distant hum of the refrigeration units behind the counter. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed on the businessman, whose name, Pete had learned from eavesdropping on his companion's conversation was Richard Blackwood, CEO of a mid-sized real estate development company that had been making headlines lately for their aggressive gentrification projects in Cincinnati's historic neighborhoods. Blackwood stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, his mind clearly racing through the implications of the very public challenge he now faced. His companions sat in uncomfortable silence, suddenly unwilling to meet his eyes, as if they could sense the shift in power dynamics that Pete's intervention had created. Sarah remained motionless, the water pitcher still clutched in her hands. But Pete could see something changing in her posture. The hunched shoulders of someone trying to make themselves invisible were gradually straightening, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not quite hope, but perhaps the recognition that she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Danny, the cook, had emerged fully from the kitchen now and stood behind the counter with his arms crossed, his weathered face set in hard lines. He had been working at Mickey's for 15 years, had seen Sarah struggle to balance 2 jobs while caring for her injured husband and young daughter, and had watched her handle difficult customers with more grace than most people could muster. The protective anger in his eyes was unmistakable. "Well?" Pete asked quietly, his voice cutting through the tension without raising in volume. "What's it going to be, Mr. Blackwood?" The use of his name seemed to surprise Blackwood, and Pete could see him calculating whether his reputation could survive the kind of public humiliation he was now facing. In the age of social media, incidents like this could go viral in hours, and Pete was counting on Blackwood's business instincts to override his ego. One of the elderly women in the corner booth had indeed been recording the confrontation on her phone, and she held it up slightly, making sure Blackwood could see the glowing screen. "This is going straight to my granddaughter," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She works for Channel 12 News." That seemed to be the final straw for Blackwood's bravado. Pete watched as the man's face went through another series of calculations, weighing his pride against potential damage to his business and reputation. The other diners were no longer just passive observers. They had become a jury, and their verdict was already written on their faces. "You know what?" Blackwood said finally, his voice brittle with forced casualness. "You're not worth it, old man. Come on, guys, let's get out of here. This place smells like grease anyway." He started to turn away, but Pete's voice stopped him cold. "That wasn't part of the deal," Pete said firmly. "You either take the wager and do what I challenged you to do, or you forfeit. Either way, you owe Sarah an apology and a proper tip for your behavior tonight." Blackwood spun around, his face flushing red with anger. "You can't force me to do anything, you washed-up gambler. Everyone knows you're a joke, banned from baseball, probably broke, desperately trying to be relevant again." The personal attack stung. Pete couldn't deny that. His gambling problems and subsequent banishment from baseball were well-documented sources of shame that he carried with him every day. But looking at Sarah, seeing the way she had straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin slightly, he realized that this moment wasn't about his past mistakes. It was about what kind of man he chose to be right now. "You're absolutely right," Pete said, surprising everyone in the diner, including Blackwood. "I made mistakes, big ones. I hurt people I cared about, damaged my reputation, and lost opportunities I'll never get back. But you know what? That doesn't give you or anyone else the right to treat people like garbage." Pete took another step forward, and this time Blackwood instinctively stepped back. "See, here's the thing about rock bottom," Pete continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Once you've been there, once you've lost everything that you thought defined you, you start to understand what really matters. And what matters is how we treat each other, especially people who can't fight back." Sarah's hands were trembling now, but not with fear or humiliation, with something that looked like suppressed emotion. She had never heard anyone stand up for her like this, had never experienced what it felt like to have someone publicly defend her dignity simply because she deserved it. "Mr. Rose," she began, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. "Thank you, but—" "No, Sarah," Pete interrupted gently, turning to look at her directly. "Don't thank me. You shouldn't have to be grateful when someone treats you with basic human decency. That should be the minimum expectation, not some special favor." Benas, he turned back to Blackwood, who was now visibly uncomfortable with the way the entire restaurant was staring at him. "So what's it going to be? Are you going to honor the wager, or are you going to walk out of here and prove to everyone what kind of man you really are?" Blackwood's jaw worked silently as he struggled with the impossible position he found himself in. His business partners were watching him. The other diners were watching him. Someone was recording him, and his behavior towards Sarah had already branded him as a bully in the eyes of everyone present. Any choice he made now would come with consequences. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight with resentment. "But I'm not doing this because you're forcing me to. I'm doing it because I'm a bigger man than you are." Pete nodded once, stepping aside to give Blackwood a clear path to the counter where Sarah stood waiting. "I'm sure that's exactly how you'll remember it," he said quietly. Blackwood walked stiffly toward Sarah, his movements awkward with reluctance. When he reached the counter, he stood there for a moment, clearly struggling with the words. The entire restaurant waited in complete silence, the only sounds coming from the rain outside and the soft hum of the coffee machines. Blackwood began, then stopped. He looked around the diner, seeing all the faces watching him, and Pete could almost see the moment when he realized that a half-hearted, resentful apology would only make him look worse. "I apologize for my behavior tonight," he said finally, his voice just loud enough to be heard throughout the restaurant. "It was inappropriate and disrespectful, and you didn't deserve to be treated that way." Sarah nodded once, accepting the apology with more grace than Blackwood deserved. "Thank you," she said simply. Blackwood reached into his wallet and pulled out several bills, placing them on the counter with obvious reluctance. Based on the amount of food and drink his table had consumed, Pete estimated their bill was probably close to $200, and the money Blackwood left appeared to match that amount. "There," Blackwood said, his tone making it clear he considered his obligation fulfilled. "Are we done here?" Pete looked at the money on the counter, then at Sarah's face, then back at Blackwood. Something in the man's demeanor, the resentful way he had apologized, the obvious reluctance with which he had left the tip, told Pete that this wasn't over. Men like Blackwood didn't accept public humiliation gracefully, and Pete had a sinking feeling that Sarah might face consequences for this confrontation long after tonight was over. "We're done," Pete said finally. "For now." Blackwood turned and stalked back to his table, gesturing sharply to his companions. "Let's go," he said curtly. "This place isn't worth our time." As the group gathered their coats and prepared to leave, Pete heard one of them mutter to Blackwood, "Jesus, Rich, did you really have to make such a scene? That was embarrassing." "Shut up, Mike," Blackwood snapped back. "You think I'm going to let some washed-up ballplayer make me look like an idiot?" Pete pretended not to hear the exchange, but he filed it away for future reference. Men like Blackwood rarely let slights go unanswered, especially when they felt they had been publicly humiliated. He made a mental note to check in on Sarah over the next few days, just to make sure there weren't any unexpected consequences from tonight's confrontation. As the group filed out into the rain, the atmosphere in Mickey's diner began to slowly return to normal. Conversations resumed, though in more subdued tones, and Pete could feel the weight of everyone's attention still focused on him and Sarah. Sarah stood behind the counter, staring down at the money Blackwood had left, her expression unreadable. Pete approached her slowly, giving her space to process what had just happened. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Sarah looked up at him, and Pete was surprised to see tears in her eyes, not tears of sadness or humiliation, but something else entirely. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. No one has ever, I've dealt with customers like that before, but no one ever. You don't need to say anything, Pete replied. You handled yourself with more dignity than they deserved. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, then looked down at the money again. This is more than I usually make in tips in a week, she said wonderingly. Miguel needs physical therapy and Isabella needs new shoes for school, and we've been behind on the electric bill. Pete felt a complex mix of emotions as he watched Sarah calculate how this unexpected windfall might help her family. Part of him was glad that something good had come from the confrontation, but part of him was also angry that a working mother should have to be grateful for the basic respect she should have received all along. Sarah, he said gently, can I ask you something? She nodded, still clutching the money. Do you know who that man was? Richard Blackwood. Sarah shook her head. Should I? Pete hesitated, then decided she deserved to know. He owns Blackwood Development. They've been buying up properties in this neighborhood, forcing out long-time residents and small businesses to build luxury condos. Sarah's face paled as the implications sank in. You think he might try to cause trouble for Mickey's because of tonight? I don't know, Pete admitted, but men like that don't usually forget when they feel they've been embarrassed. I just want you to be careful, okay? And if anything unusual happens, if he shows up again, if there are any problems with the restaurant's permits or anything like that, you call me. Pete pulled out one of his business cards and wrote his personal cell phone number on the back. I mean it, Sarah. Don't try to handle this alone if there are consequences. Sarah took the card with shaking hands. But why? Why are you doing this for me? You don't even know me. Pete was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because, he said finally, everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, and because I've made enough mistakes in my life to know that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up for what's right, even when it's inconvenient. And as Pete returned to his booth, he realized that his appetite had completely disappeared. The confrontation with Blackwood had stirred up emotions and memories he had been trying to keep buried, reminders of all the times in his past when he had failed to stand up for what was right, when he had chosen personal gain over moral clarity. But tonight had been different. Tonight, for the first time in years, Pete Rose felt like he had done something that truly mattered. 3 days after the incident at Mickey's Diner, Pete Rose found himself unable to concentrate on much of anything else. He had returned to the restaurant twice since Tuesday night, ostensibly for his usual dinner, but really to check on Sarah and make sure there had been no retaliation from Richard Blackwood. Both times she had seemed fine, grateful but not overly effusive, professional as always, with perhaps just a little more warmth in her interactions with him. But Pete's instincts, honed by decades of reading situations and people, told him that the other shoe was about to drop. Men like Blackwood didn't simply absorb public humiliation and move on with their lives. They nursed grudges, planned responses, and usually found ways to strike back when their targets least expected it. On Friday morning, Pete's concerns proved prophetic when his phone rang at 7:30 a.m. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, Sarah's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Mr. Rose, I'm sorry to call you so early, but I didn't know who else to contact. Pete was immediately alert, setting down his morning coffee and giving Sarah his full attention. What's wrong, Sarah? What happened? There are men here at Mickey's, she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. City inspectors, they say. They showed up an hour ago with official-looking paperwork, and they're going through everything. The kitchen, the storage areas, the dining room. They're writing violations for things that have never been problems before. Pete felt his stomach drop. How many violations? So far, 12. They say the grease trap needs immediate attention, that our fire extinguisher certifications are expired, that the spacing between tables doesn't meet current accessibility standards. Mister, Rose, some of these regulations they're citing, Danny says he's never even heard of them. Pete was already reaching for his jacket as he spoke. Are they still there? Yes, and Danny's getting really upset. He's been running this place for 15 years without any major problems, and now suddenly we're facing thousands of dollars in fines and potential closure if we can't fix everything within 30 days. I'll be right there, Pete said firmly. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and try to keep Danny calm. I'm on my way. As Pete drove through the morning traffic toward Mickey's, his mind was racing through the implications of what Sarah had described. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Health and safety inspections typically weren't conducted without advance notice unless there had been specific complaints, and Mickey's had operated without incident for decades. This had Richard Blackwood's fingerprints all over it. Pete had encountered this type of retaliation before during his business ventures, back when he had been trying to establish restaurants and other enterprises in Cincinnati. Powerful people with connections could make life very difficult for small business owners by leveraging regulatory agencies, calling in favors, and weaponizing bureaucracy against their targets. When Pete arrived at Mickey's, he found the parking lot unusually crowded for mid-morning on a Friday. 2 official city vehicles were parked near the entrance, and through the windows he could see men in suits and hard hats moving through the restaurant with clipboards and measuring devices. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and chaotic. Danny stood behind the counter with his arms crossed, his weathered face red with anger and frustration, while 3 city inspectors methodically documented every possible violation they could find. Sarah moved between tables with nervous efficiency, trying to continue serving the few customers who had remained despite the disruption. Pete approached the lead inspector, a thin man in his 40s who was photographing the distance between 2 tables with excessive attention to detail. "Excuse me," Pete said politely. "I'm Pete Rose, and I'm a friend of the family that owns this establishment. Could you help me understand what's happening here?" The inspector looked up with the weary expression of a bureaucrat who had dealt with countless complaints and interventions over the years. "We received specific complaints about health and safety violations at this location," he said in a monotone voice. "We're conducting a comprehensive inspection to ensure compliance with all current city codes and regulations." "And what were the nature of these complaints?" Pete asked, pulling out a small notebook to write down the man's responses. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details of complaints or identify complainants," the inspector replied, returning to his photography. "That information is confidential." Pete nodded, having expected that response. "I understand. But surely you can tell me whether these complaints came from customers who had visited the restaurant recently." The inspector paused, perhaps recognizing that Pete's questions were more sophisticated than the typical protests of upset business owners. "The complaints were filed by concerned citizens who had observed potential violations," he said carefully. "Citizens who had been inside the restaurant?" Another pause. "Not necessarily. Some violations can be observed from outside the establishment or through other means." Pete felt a cold anger building in his chest. The inspector's carefully worded responses confirmed his suspicions. Someone with influence had made calls, pulled strings, and sicked the city's regulatory apparatus on Mickey's Diner as payback for Tuesday night's confrontation. "How long has it been since this restaurant's last inspection?" Pete asked. "I'd have to check our records," the inspector replied, but his hesitation suggested he already knew the answer would be damaging to the city's case. "Because," Pete continued, his voice remaining calm but gaining an edge, "if this establishment has been operating without incident for years and suddenly faces a dozen violations all at once, that suggests either a dramatic overnight deterioration in standards or an unusually thorough inspection prompted by external pressure." The inspector looked up from his clipboard, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of Pete's questioning. "Mr. Rose, if you have concerns about this inspection, You're welcome to file an appeal through the appropriate channels." "Oh, I intend to," Pete replied, "but first, I'd like to understand the timeline. When were these complaints filed?" "I believe the initial complaint was submitted on Wednesday morning," the inspector said, then immediately looked like he regretted providing that specific detail. Pete smiled grimly. Wednesday morning, less than 12 hours after the confrontation with Blackwood. The timeline couldn't have been more obvious if Blackwood had signed his name to the complaint. Sarah appeared at Pete's elbow, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Rose, they're saying we might have to close until all the violations are corrected. We can't afford that. If we lose even a week of income, we'll never catch up." Pete placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's not going to happen," he said with quiet confidence. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The lead inspector overheard the exchange and looked up with practiced indifference. "The violations are legitimate, regardless of when they were reported. Public safety takes precedence over business concerns." "Absolutely," Pete agreed. "Public safety is paramount, which is why I'm curious about the selective nature of this inspection. Have you conducted similar comprehensive reviews of other restaurants in this neighborhood recently?" The inspector's discomfort was becoming more obvious. "We respond to complaints as they're filed." "I'm sure you do. And I am equally sure that when the local news investigates the timing and circumstances of this particular complaint, they'll find it fascinating that a restaurant with a clean record for 15 years suddenly becomes a public safety hazard within hours of its staff being publicly defended against harassment." Pete pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. "Sarah, do you mind if I make a quick call?" Without waiting for her response, Pete dialed and stepped a few feet away. The call was answered on the second ring. "Channel 12 Newsroom, this is Janet." "Janet, this is Pete Rose. I have a story for you that I think your viewers would find very interesting." Pete had known Janet Morrison for over a decade, ever since she had interviewed him during one of his many attempts to get reinstated to baseball. She was a veteran investigative reporter with a reputation for tenacity and a particular interest in stories about powerful people abusing their influence. "Pete, what do you have for me? How would you like to cover a story about a prominent local businessman using city resources to retaliate against a working mother who was sexually harassed at her job?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm listening." "Mickey's Diner on West 8th Street. Can you get a crew here in the next hour? We'll be there in 30 minutes. Pete ended the call and returned to where Sarah and the inspector were standing. The inspector had clearly overheard at least part of the conversation, and his professional detachment was beginning to crack. "Mr. Rose," the inspector said carefully, "I hope you understand that any attempt to interfere with an official inspection could result in additional penalties." "I'm not interfering with anything," Pete replied cheerfully. "I'm simply exercising my right as a concerned citizen to ensure that our tax dollars are being used appropriately and not as weapons in personal vendettas." Danny had been listening to the exchange from behind the counter, and now he approached with the aggressive posture of a man who had reached the end of his patience. 15 years, he said to the inspector, his voice shaking with anger. 15 years I've run this place without a single major violation, and now you show up here acting like I'm running some kind of health hazard. This is bullshit, and everybody knows it." "Danny," Pete said quietly, "let me handle this." But Danny was beyond listening to reason. "No, Pete, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this is my restaurant, my livelihood. And I'm not going to stand here and let some pencil-pushing bureaucrat destroy everything I've built because some rich asshole got his feelings hurt." The inspector's face flushed at Danny's words. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down and allow us to complete our inspection." "Calm down?" Danny's voice rose. "You want me to calm down while you manufacture violations that don't exist? While you threaten to shut down a business that's been serving this community for decades?" Pete could see the situation escalating beyond his control, and he knew that Danny's anger, however justified, would only give the inspectors more ammunition to use against Mickey's. He needed to diffuse the tension before someone said or did something that would make the situation irreversibly worse. "Danny," Pete said firmly, stepping between the cook and the inspector, "I need you to trust me on this. Go take a break, walk around the block, get some air, and let me handle this situation." Danny looked like he was about to argue, but something in Pete's tone made him reconsider. "Fine," he said finally, "but if this place gets shut down, I'm holding you responsible." As Danny stalked out the back door, Pete turned his attention back to the inspector, who was now looking decidedly uncomfortable with the spotlight that was about to be shone on his work. "Now then," Pete said pleasantly, "why don't we take a more careful look at these violations? I'd like to understand exactly what standards we're applying here." For the next 20 minutes, Pete methodically went through each violation with the inspector, asking detailed questions about the specific regulations being cited, the measurements being taken, and the standards being applied. His years of dealing with contracts, negotiations, and legal challenges had taught him how to ask the right questions, and it quickly became apparent that several of the violations were based on interpretations of regulations that were, at best, questionable. The spacing between tables, for instance, was being measured according to accessibility standards that had been designed for new construction, not existing establishments. The grease trap violation was based on maintenance schedules that exceeded what was actually required by law. Several other citations appeared to be based on regulations that were either outdated or didn't actually apply to establishments like Mickey's. By the time Janet Morrison and her camera crew arrived, Pete had managed to establish a clear pattern of overzealous enforcement that would be difficult for the city to defend publicly. Janet was a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair, dressed in the kind of practical business attire that suggested she was always ready to chase a story. She took one look around the restaurant, at the inspectors with their clipboards, at Sarah hovering nervously behind the counter, at Pete standing in the middle of it all with his notebook full of questions, and immediately understood the dynamics at play. "Pete," she said warmly, "looks like you've got quite a situation here." "Indeed I do," Pete replied. "Janet Morrison, I'd like you to meet Sarah Martinez, one of the hardest working people in Cincinnati and the target of what appears to be a very selective enforcement action." Janet's eyes lit up with the gleam of a reporter sensing a good story. "Sarah, would you be willing to talk to me about what's been happening here?" Sarah looked nervously at Pete, who nodded encouragingly. I guess so, but I don't want to cause more trouble." "The trouble's already been caused," Pete said gently. "Now we're just making sure people understand who caused it and why." As Janet set up her interview with Sarah, Pete noticed that the inspectors were wrapping up their work with considerably more haste than they had shown earlier. The presence of television cameras had apparently given them a sudden desire to be somewhere else. "Gentlemen," Pete called out to the departing inspectors, "I hope you'll be available for follow-up questions. Channel 12 might want to get your perspective on the complaint process and how you determine which establishments receive such thorough attention." The lead inspector paused at the door, clearly torn between his desire to escape and his professional obligation to defend his work. "Our inspection procedures are a matter of public record," he said finally. "Anyone with questions can contact our office during regular business hours." "Oh, they will," Pete assured him. "I have a feeling this story is going to generate a lot of public interest in how our city government operates." After the inspectors left, Pete stood in the suddenly quiet restaurant and surveyed the scene. Sarah was giving her interview to Janet, telling the story of Tuesday night's harassment and Friday morning's suspicious inspection with increasing confidence. A few regular customers had returned, drawn by curiosity about the television crew and staying for the solidarity of supporting a neighborhood institution under attack. Danny had returned from his walk. Calmer, but still simmering with anger about the morning's events, he approached Pete with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Thanks for stepping in," he said quietly. "I was about to do something stupid." "We all were," Pete replied. "But sometimes the smartest thing you can do is make sure the right people are watching when someone tries to abuse their power." "You think this will work? The news story?" Pete considered the question carefully. "I think Richard Blackwood is about to learn that there are consequences for using city resources to settle personal grudges. And I think the city inspectors are about to get a lesson in the importance of consistent, fair enforcement of regulations." Sarah finished her interview and approached Pete with tears in her eyes, tears of relief rather than fear this time. "Thank you," she said simply. "I was so scared this morning. I thought we were going to lose everything." "You're not going to lose anything," Pete said firmly. "In fact, I have a feeling that Mickey's Diner is about to become the most famous restaurant in Cincinnati." As if to prove his point, the bell above the door chimed, and a steady stream of customers began entering the restaurant. Word was apparently spreading through the neighborhood about the morning's events, and people were coming to show their support for Sarah, Danny, and Mickey's. Within an hour, the restaurant was fuller than Pete had ever seen it, with a line of people waiting for tables and Danny scrambling to keep up with orders. Sarah moved through the crowd with renewed energy, her earlier fear replaced by something that looked remarkably like pride. Pete remained at his usual booth, watching the scene unfold with deep satisfaction. He had learned long ago that standing up for what's right often comes with a cost, but he had also learned that the cost of not standing up is usually much higher. As he prepared to leave, Sarah approached his table one more time. "Mr. Rose," she said, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Pete stood up and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, you don't need to thank me. You just need to remember that you deserve to be treated with respect. Always. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." As Pete walked out of Mickey's Diner and into the afternoon sunshine, he realized that something fundamental had changed in his understanding of his own purpose. For years, he had been focused on his own redemption, his own legacy, his own attempts to regain what he had lost through his mistakes and poor choices. But today had shown him that redemption wasn't about getting back what you had lost. It was about using what you had learned to help others avoid the same fate. It was about standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, about using whatever influence or resources you had to level playing fields that had been tilted against the vulnerable. For the first time in years, Pete Rose felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. 2 weeks after the incident at Mickey's Diner became front-page news in Cincinnati, Pete Rose found himself sitting in an unexpectedly familiar place, the law offices of Patterson, Morrison and Associates, the same firm that had represented him during his darkest days, dealing with gambling allegations and IRS troubles. But today, he wasn't there as a client seeking help with his own problems. Today, he was there as a witness in what had become a much larger story about corruption, abuse of power, and the way wealthy individuals could manipulate city government to serve their personal vendettas. Janet Morrison's initial news story had been picked up by regional and then national media outlets, transforming what might have been a local interest piece into a symbol of larger issues plaguing American cities. The story had everything that resonated with modern audiences: a working mother being harassed, a wealthy businessman abusing his power, a fallen sports hero finding redemption through standing up for others, and a clear example of how the system could be weaponized against the vulnerable. The public response had been swift and decisive. Mickey's Diner had seen record crowds for 2 straight weeks, with people coming from across the region to show support for Sarah and Danny. A GoFundMe campaign started by a local college student had raised over $50,000 to help the restaurant cover the costs of addressing the legitimate violations that had been found during the inspection. Most importantly, the Cincinnati City Council had launched a formal investigation into the complaint process and the conduct of the inspection that had targeted Mickey's. But the most significant development had come when Richard Blackwood's business practices came under scrutiny. Investigative reporters, energized by the initial story, had begun digging into Blackwood Development's history and discovered a pattern of similar retaliation against anyone who opposed their projects. Former tenants told stories of sudden harassment by city inspectors after complaining about Blackwood's tactics. Small business owners described mysterious permit delays and regulatory challenges that appeared whenever they resisted Blackwood's attempts to buy their properties. The pattern was so clear and so extensive that it had attracted the attention of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Now, as Pete sat in the law office conference room, he was reviewing his testimony for the federal grand jury that would be considering charges against Blackwood and several city officials who had allegedly been part of his network of influence. The key thing to remember, Attorney David Patterson was explaining, is to stick to what you personally observed and experienced. Don't speculate about motives or make assumptions about Blackwood's intentions. Pete nodded, though he found the advice somewhat ironic. After years of having his own actions scrutinized and his motivations questioned, he understood better than most the importance of sticking to provable facts. What about the timeline? Pete asked. The connection between Tuesday night's confrontation and Wednesday morning's complaint? That's circumstantial evidence, but it's compelling when combined with everything else we've uncovered, Patterson replied. The grand jury will hear testimony from multiple witnesses about similar patterns of behavior stretching back several years. As they talked, Pete's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Lunch rush was crazy again today. Danny says we might need to hire another server. Thank you for everything. Pete smiled, remembering his visit to Mickey's the previous evening. The restaurant had been transformed not just by the increased business, but by the confidence and pride he could see in Sarah's demeanor. She moved through the dining room with her head held high, treating every customer with the same professional warmth. But now there was something different in her bearing, a sense of dignity that no one could take away from her. Miguel, her husband, had been there too, still using a walker but insisting on helping where he could. Their daughter Isabella, a bright-eyed 8-year-old, had been doing homework at the corner booth, occasionally looking up to wave at the regular customers who had become part of her extended family. Pete, Patterson continued, pulling him back to the present, I want to make sure you understand the significance of what you did, not just the immediate impact on Sarah and Mickey's, but the broader implications. What do you mean? Patterson leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. You've probably heard this before, but redemption isn't just about fixing your own mistakes. It's about using what you've learned from those mistakes to prevent others from being hurt. Pete was quiet for a moment, considering the attorney's words. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, he said finally. For years, I was so focused on trying to get back into baseball, trying to restore my reputation, trying to prove that I was still the same person I was before everything went wrong. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe I needed to become a different person entirely. How so? When I was playing, everything was about winning, about personal achievement, about being the best. I lost sight of the fact that success without character is hollow. It took losing everything to understand that how you treat people, especially people who can't do anything for you in return, is what really defines who you are. Patterson nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of insight that makes your testimony so powerful. You're not just another witness describing what happened. You're someone who has genuinely grappled with questions of character and responsibility. Pete's phone rang, and he saw Danny's name on the caller ID. "Excuse me for a moment," he said to Patterson, then answered the call. "Pete, thank God you picked up." Danny's voice was tight with worry. "We've got a situation here. Blackwood just showed up." Pete felt his stomach drop. "At the restaurant? Right now?" "Yeah, he walked in about 5 minutes ago with 2 other guys in suits. He's sitting at a corner booth, not ordering anything, just staring at Sarah. She's trying to stay professional, but I can see how scared she is." Pete was already standing up, grabbing his jacket. "Call the police, Danny. Don't wait, don't hesitate, just call them." "Should I ask him to leave?" "No, absolutely not. Don't engage with him at all. Just call the police and tell them there's a potential harassment situation involving someone who's been in the news lately. They'll understand." Pete ended the call and turned to Patterson. "I'm sorry, but I need to go. Blackwood just showed up at Mickey's." Patterson's face darkened. "That's either incredibly stupid or incredibly dangerous, maybe both. I'll call you later," Pete said, already heading for the door. The drive to Mickey's took 15 minutes, during which Pete's mind raced through various scenarios, none of them good. Men like Blackwood, when cornered and facing serious legal consequences, often became unpredictable. The fact that he had chosen to show up at the restaurant, especially with the federal investigation ongoing, suggested either desperation or a level of arrogance that bordered on the sociopathic. When Pete arrived at Mickey's, he was relieved to see 2 police cars already in the parking lot. Through the restaurant windows, he could see the officers talking to Danny behind the counter, while Blackwood sat at his corner booth, apparently calm and composed. Pete entered the restaurant and immediately located Sarah, who was taking an order from a family at a center table. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she was maintaining her professional demeanor. When she saw Pete, the relief on her face was obvious. Officer Maria Rodriguez, whom Pete recognized from previous visits to the neighborhood, approached him as he entered. "Mr. Rose, we got a call about a potential harassment situation?" "That's right. The man in the corner booth is Richard Blackwood. He's been involved in an ongoing dispute with this restaurant, and there are federal charges pending against him. His presence here, especially given the circumstances, constitutes intimidation." Officer Rodriguez glanced toward Blackwood's table, where the businessman sat with his 2 companions, nursing a cup of coffee and occasionally looking around the restaurant with what appeared to be casual interest. "Has he made any threats or engaged in any specific threatening behavior?" "Not directly," Pete admitted, "but given the history and the timing, his presence here is clearly intended to intimidate the staff." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Let me go talk to him." Pete watched as the officer approached Blackwood's table. The conversation was brief and conducted in low tones, but Pete could see Blackwood's body language shift from relaxed confidence to barely controlled anger as Rodriguez spoke to him. After a few minutes, Blackwood stood up abruptly, threw some money on the table and headed for the door with his companions. As he passed Pete, he paused for just a moment. "This isn't over," he said quietly, just loud enough for Pete to hear. "Yes, it is," Pete replied calmly. "You just haven't realized it yet." Blackwood's face flushed with anger, but with the police officers watching, he continued toward the door without another word. After Blackwood left, the atmosphere in the restaurant slowly began to return to normal, though Pete could see that the staff remained shaken by the encounter. He approached Sarah, who was standing behind the counter, trying to compose herself. "You okay?" Sarah nodded, though her hands were still trembling slightly. "I don't understand what he was trying to accomplish by coming here. Did he think he could scare me into changing my story?" "Men like that," Pete said, "they're not used to facing consequences for their actions. When the walls start closing in, they often lash out in ways that don't make logical sense." Danny appeared from the kitchen, his face red with anger. "That son of a bitch had some nerve showing up here. If the cops hadn't been here—" "Danny," Pete interrupted, That's exactly what he was hoping for. He wanted you to lose your temper, to do something that would make you look bad and give him ammunition to use against you. Pete's phone buzzed with a call from Patterson. "Pete, I just heard from the prosecutor's office. Blackwood showing up at the restaurant today was exactly the kind of witness intimidation they needed to move forward with additional charges. They're issuing a warrant for his arrest within the hour." Pete felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with relief. "Good. How long do you think this will take to resolve?" "The investigation is moving faster than anyone expected, mainly because of the amount of evidence they've uncovered and the number of people willing to testify. We're looking at weeks, not months." Over the following days, the story of Blackwood's arrest and the expanding federal investigation dominated local news. Pete found himself being interviewed regularly, not just about the specific incident at Mickey's, but about broader questions of character, redemption, and the responsibility that comes with influence. In one particularly memorable interview with Janet Morrison, she asked him directly about how this experience had changed his perspective on his own legacy. "For years," Pete said, looking directly into the camera, "I was focused on what I had lost. My place in the Hall of Fame, my reputation, my standing in baseball. But this experience has taught me that legacy isn't about what you achieve for yourself. It's about what you do for others, especially when no one is watching and when there's nothing in it for you." "Do you think this changes how people see you?" Pete considered the question carefully. "I hope it shows people that everyone is capable of growth, that our mistakes don't have to define us permanently. But more importantly, I hope it shows that ordinary people like Sarah Martinez have extraordinary courage and dignity. And that's worth fighting for regardless of who gets the credit." 3 weeks later, Richard Blackwood pled guilty to federal charges of conspiracy, bribery, and using his position to intimidate witnesses. He was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and ordered to pay substantial fines and restitution. Several city officials were also charged and convicted, leading to significant reforms in Cincinnati's inspection and permit processes. But for Pete, the most meaningful outcome was what happened at Mickey's Diner itself. The restaurant had not only survived the attempted retaliation, but had thrived, becoming a symbol of community resilience and the power of standing up for what's right. Sarah had been promoted to assistant manager, and she and Miguel were able to move their family to a better apartment. Isabella started taking piano lessons with money from the GoFundMe campaign, and her artwork now decorated the walls of the restaurant's main dining room. Danny hired 2 additional servers and a part-time cook, and Mickey's began staying open later to accommodate the increased business. The restaurant became a gathering place for community meetings and local events, transforming from just another neighborhood diner into a genuine hub of civic engagement. On a cold December evening, exactly 3 months after the initial confrontation, Pete sat in his usual booth at Mickey's, sharing a piece of apple pie with Isabella while Sarah finished her shift. The little girl was telling him about her school play, where she was going to perform a piano piece she had learned. "Mr. Pete," she said seriously, "my mama says you're a hero because you helped us when that mean man was being nasty." Pete looked across the restaurant at Sarah, who was smiling as she cleaned tables, then back at Isabella's earnest young face. "You know what, sweetheart? The real hero is your mama. She works hard every day to take care of you and your daddy, and she never let anyone make her feel small, even when they tried to. That takes more courage than anything I've ever done." Isabella considered this gravely, then nodded. "Mama is pretty brave, but so are you. Danny says you stood up to the bad man even though you didn't have to." "Sometimes," Pete said, "the most important thing you can do is stand up for someone else, especially when they can't stand up for themselves. Remember that, okay?" As Isabella returned to her homework and Sarah finished her closing duties, Pete reflected on how much his life had changed over the past few months. He was still banned from baseball, still carried the weight of his past mistakes, still faced financial and legal challenges that would probably never fully disappear. But he had found something he hadn't realized he was looking for, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal achievement or public recognition. He had discovered that redemption wasn't about erasing the past or getting back what you had lost. It was about using what you had learned, both from your successes and your failures, to make a positive difference in other people's lives. When Sarah finished her shift and was ready to leave, she stopped by Pete's booth, as she always did. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked with a smile. "Wouldn't miss it," Pete replied, "though I might try the meatloaf instead of my usual." "Living dangerously," Sarah laughed. "I like that." As Pete watched Sarah gather her things and head home to her family, he realized that this small diner on West 8th Street had become more than just his refuge from the complications of his public life. It had become the place where Pete Rose, despite all his flaws and failures, had finally learned what it meant to be the kind of person worthy of the second chances he had been seeking all along. The rain that had been falling the night everything began had stopped, and through the windows of Mickey's diner, Pete could see stars emerging in the clear December sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between self-interest and doing what was right. But tonight, in this warm, well-lit place filled with honest people living honest lives, Pete Rose felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt at peace with who he was becoming.